There's something sacred about the rhythm of farm life. The way the sun rises over golden fields, the scent of tilled earth and fresh hay, the quiet companionship of animals who ask for little more than food and kindness. For years, my farm had been my sanctuary. Away from the city noise and nosy neighbors, I found peace in the stillness of early mornings, when dew clung to the grass, and the only sounds were birdsong and the soft clatter of hooves. I didn't need much, just the open land, the freedom to work with my hands, and the satisfaction of living off the grid, answering to no one but the seasons. The property was handed down to me by my grandfather, a stubborn man with dirt under his nails and wisdom in his silence. He taught me how to listen to the land, how to respect its boundaries, and more importantly, how to draw my own. I kept things simple. A few chickens, a couple of goats, and a trusty old tractor that coughed and wheezed but never failed. My nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road, and that's just the way I liked it. But then the development started. Just beyond the tree line, shiny prefab houses began sprouting like weeds. They called it Meadow Creek Estates, a name so artificial it made me wince. Along with the pastel shutters and plastic fences came the thing I feared most: rules. And at the center of those rules was a woman who would soon make it her mission to disrupt the quiet life I had built. I didn't know her name then, but I felt her presence like a storm rolling in. Something told me my days of peace and privacy were numbered, and it all started with the sound of distant drone blades. Her name was Karen, and she introduced herself like she was royalty, descending upon a commoner. It was a Saturday morning, and I was mending a fence post near the road when her SUV rolled up, spotless and shimmering in the sunlight, like it had never seen a dirt road in its life. The window buzzed down, and out leaned a woman in oversized sunglasses, a sun hat, and the unmistakable air of self-importance. She didn't smile. Instead, she wrinkled her nose, scanned my property like she was inspecting a crime scene, and asked in a clipped tone, "Are you the owner of this place?" I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. She introduced herself as the president of the Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, as if that title meant anything on my side of the property line. Without missing a beat, she began listing concerns raised by her community. The goats were unsightly. The tractor was rusty. The compost pile apparently was causing an odor. I blinked, unsure whether to laugh or explain to her that my farm was established long before her vinyl village popped up next door. I chose the latter, as politely as I could. Karen didn't take kindly to being told she had no jurisdiction here. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she reminded me that her community had aesthetic standards and property values to protect. She even handed me a flyer, an actual printed flyer, detailing guidelines for acceptable lawn maintenance and exterior decor, as if I might swap my barn for a beige two-story with solar garden lights. I glanced at the flyer, then at my weathered fields and loyal livestock, and handed it back. From that day on, Karen made it clear that she considered my farm an eyesore. She didn't like the smell of animals or the sound of roosters crowing in the morning. She detested the dust that kicked up whenever I drove my old truck down the gravel road. But what she hated most, I suspect, was the fact that I didn't answer to her. I wasn't part of her world of HOA meetings and color-coded mailboxes. I was something she couldn't control, and that, more than anything, drove her absolutely mad. It started subtly, almost innocently, like a nuisance you try to ignore until it grows teeth. The first time I noticed the drone, I was out feeding the chickens at dawn. A soft, mechanical hum drifted through the cool morning air, unfamiliar and unnatural. I looked up and spotted a little black dot in the sky, hovering just above the treetops. At first I figured it was a hobbyist's toy, maybe some kid in the new neighborhood playing around before school. But it didn't leave. It just floated there, watching. The next day, there were two. They buzzed slowly over the goat pasture, dipping low enough to make the animals nervous. My oldest goat, Daisy, let out a startled bleat and bolted for the shelter. I followed the drones with my eyes, tracking them as they made wide, lazy loops over my barn, my fields, my porch. I stood still, hands on my hips, watching them watching me. And then, as if they'd seen enough, they veered off toward the direction of Meadow Creek Estates. That night, I drove down the road and parked just outside the HOA's entrance, keeping my truck's lights off. I waited. Sure enough, one of the drones came sailing back overhead and descended into the backyard of a pale yellow house, with a garden gnome army guarding the flower beds. Karen's house. I recognized the oversized patio furniture and tacky bird bath from the time she invited herself over to complain about my compost bin. She was behind it, no doubt in my mind. The following week, the drone activity escalated. They showed up at all hours, morning, noon, even dusk, zipping around like mechanical mosquitoes with cameras for eyes. They peeked into windows, hovered over the tool shed, and once, I swear, followed me as I walked from the coop to the barn. I could hear the faint whir behind me, like a hunter stalking prey. It was invasive, infuriating, and more than a little creepy. I confronted Karen directly, walked right up to her pastel-painted door, and knocked like a man who'd had enough. She answered in a silk robe, holding a mug that said "Boss Lady," and gave me a smug little smile like she'd been expecting me. When I brought up the drones, she widened her eyes in mock surprise and said she had no idea what I was talking about. Maybe some kids in the neighborhood, she offered, lips curling just enough to betray the lie. Or maybe you're just feeling a little watched. I left without saying another word, but inside I was boiling. This wasn't just petty behavior anymore. It was surveillance, trespassing. An unspoken war had begun, and Karen had made the first move. I didn't know yet how far she'd go, but I knew this. If she wanted a battle, she'd picked the wrong farmer. The drones didn't just keep coming, they multiplied, like a swarm sent straight from Karen's passive-aggressive war room. By the third week, they were flying closer to the ground, dipping beneath the treetops and hovering just feet above my pasture. The cows grew jumpy, the chickens scattered at every buzz, and even my dog, a laid-back mutt named Roscoe, took to growling whenever he heard that electric hum approach. I stopped working in the fields without a hat pulled low and sunglasses covering my eyes, not because of the sun, but because I knew lenses were always watching. Then came the letters, typed, folded precisely, and stuffed into my mailbox without a stamp, as if that gave them some sort of legal weight. The letterhead read, Meadow Creek Estates Neighborhood Advisory Council, a council that didn't exist last I checked, and the body was filled with vague threats about nuisance behavior, visible clutter, and non-compliance with community standards. I laughed when I first read them, but the laughter faded when I realized they were signed. Karen's name in loopy cursive, with her self-appointed title right below. It was clear she wanted to blur the line between our properties, to pretend her HOA somehow extended its reach past the boundaries of my land. One morning, I walked outside to find a drone hovering no more than 6 feet from my porch swing, just idling there, facing directly into my living room window. My curtains were open. I froze, heart pounding, before slamming the door shut and pulling the blinds closed. That was the moment it stopped being a nuisance and became something far more sinister. I had no doubt Karen was watching me, not just my animals, not just my land, but me. Things only got worse. I installed tall wooden signs that read, "Private property, no trespassing, drones will be shot," and put up fencing along the shared edge of the property line. I even called the sheriff, who chuckled sympathetically, but told me unless the drones were physically entering my home or causing property damage, there wasn't much he could do. grey area, he said, shaking his head. Real tricky with all these new gadgets. One afternoon I was showering outside, an old habit I'd never stopped, even with indoor plumbing, when I heard the now familiar hum. I whipped around in time to catch the drone angling toward me, a blinking red light on its underside. I scrambled for a towel, but I knew it had seen plenty. I'd never felt so violated on my own land. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my porch, lights off, watching the tree line. I realized Karen wasn't just being nosy, she was trying to dominate, to extend her authority over everything she could see. But she'd forgotten one thing about farmers. We may be patient, but we know exactly how to deal with pests. It was just after sunrise when I heard the terrified bellow from the pasture. I dropped my coffee mug and sprinted out the door, heart pounding. Daisy, the same goat who'd once eaten a hole through my flannel shirt, was thrashing in the tall grass, her back leg caught in the fencing. The other goats had scattered, eyes wide, and just above them hovered one of those damn drones, spinning in lazy, intrusive circles like a vulture looking for its next meal. Daisy must have been spooked, bolted, and got herself tangled. I rushed in, calming her down with soft words while I cut her free. Her leg was scraped up, bleeding but not broken. Still, the fury in my chest was white hot. I didn't call Karen this time. I didn't write a note or make a passive sign. I marched down to her house, fists clenched, boots thudding like war drums on her pristine walkway. She was in the front yard, standing beside her hydrangeas with a controller in her hand. No subtlety anymore. She didn't flinch when I approached, just looked up over her sunglasses with that smug, brittle smile of hers. "You're trespassing," she said before I even opened my mouth. I told her what happened, that her drone had caused injury, that it was over the line, both literally and morally. She sipped her iced tea like she was bored. Then she said something I'll never forget. "If you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't mind being monitored. This is about accountability." I looked at her standing there, in her tennis whites and perfect hair, holding that cheap plastic controller like it made her queen of the world. In that moment, I saw exactly what she was, a tyrant in a flower bed. And I realized no conversation, no law, no neighborly warning was going to make her stop. She was going to keep pushing, keep prying, until I either rolled over or pushed back. When I turned to leave, I didn't say a word. I just nodded to myself, the kind of nod that says, "All right. You asked for this." Because if she wanted a battle of boundaries and technology, I was ready to fight on those terms. Only this time I wouldn't be using fences or signs. I'd be using silence, interference, and just enough science to send her toys crashing down like the arrogance they were built on. Back at the farm, I sat at the kitchen table, Daisy lying nearby with a wrapped leg and her head resting gently against the cabinet. I opened my old laptop, the one I used for tax season and nothing else, and started doing some late-night research. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. I wanted to sip coffee without wondering who was watching me from above. But Karen had declared war, and I had no choice but to respond in kind. And that's when I stumbled onto the world of signal jamming. I didn't know much about electronics, but I knew enough to follow a tutorial. Turns out, drones are vulnerable in one very specific way. They rely entirely on GPS and remote control signals. Cut those off, and they drop out of the sky like stones. The legality of it? Well, let's just say I wasn't planning to broadcast across a city block. I wanted something small, something focused, something that kept my airspace, mine and mine alone. I spent a few nights collecting parts, an old ham radio antenna, a few circuits, some parts from the local junk shop that the owner didn't even know the names of. I set up my workbench in the barn, next to the shelves of tools and rusted farm equipment. My hands, usually used to wood and wire fencing, learned the delicate balance of soldering. Wires twisted, connections clicked into place, and slowly it began to come together, my little miracle of freedom. To disguise it, I built it into a scarecrow, gave it a tattered coat, a floppy hat, and 2 button eyes that didn't blink. Inside the chest cavity, hidden beneath a loose patch of burlap, sat the jammer. I tested its range carefully, walking the perimeter with an old drone I bought for this purpose. When I crossed the invisible line, the drone stuttered in the air like a drunk bird and dropped softly into the grass. Perfect. I positioned the scarecrow in the middle of the main pasture, facing the neighborhood like a silent guardian. The moment I powered it on, a strange calm settled over me. No hum, no buzz, just wind and leaves and the distant cluck of chickens. The next morning, I poured my coffee and walked outside, half expecting to see one of Karen's machines circling overhead. Instead, I saw a black drone twitching, faltering in the sky, then spinning like a dying fly before plummeting behind my woodshed with a satisfying thunk. I smiled for the first time in days. Not a petty smile, not cruel, just the deep, satisfied grin of a man who had taken back what was his. Karen would never see it coming. Her drones would fail again and again, and there'd be no one to blame but herself. And all the while, my silent scarecrow would keep standing tall, watching the watchers. The first crash was almost poetic. I heard the familiar buzz just after breakfast and stepped out onto the porch with my coffee in hand, watching as a sleek silver drone wobbled above the goat pen, like it had a hangover. It spun, jerked, and then, as if struck by an invisible hammer, plummeted straight into a patch of wild grass. The goats barely flinched. Roscoe gave a satisfied bark, like he'd been waiting for that moment all week. I leaned on the railing, took a long sip of coffee, and smiled without a word. The next few days turned into a circus of mid-air malfunctions. One by one, Karen's drones drifted in like uninvited guests and dropped like dead birds. They crashed into troughs, haystacks, and once into the side of my barn, leaving a small dent and a trail of broken plastic like breadcrumbs. Some would make it just inside the jammer's radius before they went haywire, lights blinking, rotors stuttering, before they gave up on flight altogether. I started keeping a collection of them, stacking their mangled carcasses beside the shed like trophies from a very modern hunt. Karen must have thought it was some sort of freak interference. The first 2 losses probably didn't faze her. By the 3rd or 4th, though, I imagine she started connecting dots. She was nothing if not persistent, and it was almost comical to watch her throw everything she had at me. New models, different brands, even a high-end racing drone that zipped in low and fast like a military scout. It dropped quicker than all the others, flipping mid-air before smashing into a wheelbarrow with a crunch that echoed across the pasture. I caught a glimpse of her once, standing on her back patio with her arms crossed, staring toward my land with binoculars. She looked furious, like a queen watching her fleet sink into the sea. And yet, she kept launching them. Maybe she thought she could find a blind spot. Maybe she was hoping one would break through and deliver some footage to feed her need for control. But there were no blind spots. The jammer worked like a charm, and every time one of her machines fell out of the sky, I felt a little more of my freedom return. I never said a word to her during this time. No texts, no calls, no signs or warnings. I figured the silence would be more maddening than anything I could say. The land was quiet again. The animals were calm. I walked the fields without shadows above me. And all the while, the scarecrow stood in the center of it all, arms outstretched, hat pulled low, holding its invisible line of defense like a farmer's last laugh. Karen wanted to watch, to intrude, to rule. But now, every time she tried, her precious little spies ended up face down in the dirt. It was only a matter of time before Karen snapped. I was mending a fence post near the road when I saw her marching down the gravel in crisp white sneakers, fists clenched, sunglasses perched high like a battle crown. She was holding something in her hand, a crumpled piece of plastic that looked suspiciously like one of her fallen drones. When she reached the gate, she didn't even wait for me to look up before launching into her tirade. "I know what you're doing," she shrieked, waving the broken drone like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. "This is illegal. You're interfering with federally regulated airspace, and I swear I will call the FAA, the sheriff, the National Guard if I have to." I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans. Her face was red, eyes wild, nostrils flaring like she'd just lost the final round of a suburban chess match. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I just pointed to the camera mounted discreetly under my porch roof. She followed my finger, her mouth twitching. "You've been flying drones over private property, Karen," I said calmly. "Over my livestock, my home, into my windows. I have weeks of footage, including one of your drones hovering just outside my outdoor shower. You want to talk about illegal?" She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her fingers gripped the drone tighter, knuckles pale. I stepped closer, not threatening, just firm. I told her I'd already spoken with a lawyer and showed him the footage. I'd also forwarded it to a few friends who knew their way around social media. There were laws about stalking, harassment, and trespassing, even with toys and HOA titles. Karen backed away, still muttering about lawsuits and legal action, but her voice had lost its edge. There was no press conference, no dramatic showdown in court. Just a woman who'd realized her control had boundaries, and she had crossed them. Within the week, the drones stopped coming. A month later, the neighborhood held a quiet vote, and Karen was replaced as HOA president. Her house went up for sale soon after. No goodbye, no apology. Just a for sale sign swaying in the wind like a white flag. The air over my farm has never felt so still, so perfectly mine. Mornings returned to the quiet I'd once taken for granted. Just the rustle of leaves, the distant cluck of chickens, and Roscoe's paws padding across the porch. Daisy healed up fine, and the animals seemed to sense the change too, moving easier, calmer, as if the sky itself had stopped watching. The scarecrow still stands tall in the field, weathered now, its hat drooping slightly. But I keep it there as a reminder, not just of what I protected, but of what I reclaimed. Karen's old house eventually sold to a quiet retired couple who waved from their porch and never once mentioned property aesthetics or zoning codes. The neighborhood, freed from her grip, settled into something more tolerable, even friendly. Every so often, I'll find a bit of shattered plastic in the tall grass, the remnants of a drone that dared to cross the line. I chuckle, toss it in the junk bin, and go about my day. Victory didn't come with a bang or a lawsuit. It came with silence, with peace, with the simple joy of living unbothered, beneath a wide open sky that finally belonged to me again.